Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. It's an honor to have you all here. My name is Yusuf Suraj, and I'd like to start by saying Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you. Thanks for joining on World Environment Day for saving our planet, faith in action. As always, it's important to start our events by acknowledging that in Metro Vancouver, in the Fraser Valley, and in the Lower Mainland, where our homes, houses of worship, and places of work are hosted, they are hosted on the unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish, Musqueam, Wiltsum, the Katzie, the Kwantlen, the Coquitlam, the Matski, the Kaikat, the Semahu, the Tawasin, and the Stolo First Nations. So where we live and work, the people of these First Nations, as well as their ancestors, has cared for this land for thousands of years. And we honor them and we appreciate their stewardship. To stand in allyship with our First Nations brothers, sisters, and friends, and in recognition of the horrific discovery this week of 215 children who were buried at Kamloops Residential School, I would like to ask that everyone observe and honor a moment of silence for these children, their families, and their communities. Part of the motivation for today's event is that we want to recognize that climate change does impact Indigenous and racialized communities in disproportionate ways. We believe that our diverse faith communities are uniquely equipped to consider the complex circumstances contributing to climate change and our collective moral obligation to mitigate its impacts. We recognize an extraordinary opportunity for us to come together as multi-faith communities to act on climate change together. I want to give a shout out to all of the great teams and folks behind the scenes who helped to bring this event today, starting with my colleague and dear friend Tariq Tayyab. Tariq is Vice President of the BC Muslim Association, which is the largest Muslim organization in British Columbia with 17 branches across the province. He's also a founder of the Muslim Food Bank and Community Services, which provides daily food distribution, mental health services, and counseling for vulnerable communities. And Tariq is also a co-founder of Islam Unravelled Anti-Racism Initiative, which is the official faith-based community convener for the province of British Columbia. I'd also like to thank tonight's panel moderator, Vancouver City Councillor Christine Boyle, Kim Worker from Temple Shalom as well, and Kyle M. Herringham from the Starfish Canada, who also helped to organize. We'd also like to thank all our friends, our allies, supporters, and a big thank you to all our speakers tonight, as well as their awesome support teams for helping to contribute their time, knowledge, and passion to make this initiative a reality. So it's my pleasure to now introduce tonight's first speaker, the Reverend Blair Odney, President of the Pacific Mountain Regional Council of the United Church of Canada. The Pacific Mountain Regional Council is an administrative and service delivery body of the United Church of Canada. They have over 200 congregations in BC. And recently, Reverend Blair was called to be lead minister at Queens Avenue United Church in Westminster. So I'd like to pass it on to Reverend Odney.
Yusuf, thank you for that. Thank you for your kindness. I was listening to the panel speak about their delight in being involved in the panel, and I echo that. I'm like, oh my, like I want to take pictures and show my mother, except my mom's not here, but you know what I mean. So I'm very excited to be amongst you tonight. I want to echo the acknowledgement that you began with, Yusuf. It's very important that I recognize on behalf of the church that the Pacific Mountain Regional Council and our member communities reside within and among a complex network of Indigenous communities that have relations that go back many millennia. We acknowledge that this is unceded territory, and very few lands have entered in a treaty relationship with the British Crown or Canada. We remember on behalf of the church that we are visitors and guests in this homeland for many Indigenous families, and we reside by the grace and goodwill of the First Nations, some of who have sought relationships within the missionary arm of the United Church of Canada. In his book, Embers, Ojibwe author Richard Wagami shares wisdom from one of his elders. It's necessary to repeat the important things 3 times. He writes, you listen the first time and you become aware. That's for your head. You hear the second time. You hear the second time and you awaken. That's for your heart. You feel the third time and it becomes a part of you. That's for your spirit. 3 times. So you learn to listen with your whole being. I want to offer a couple of personal stories. In grade 8, I was the editor of my junior high school yearbook. It was called Queen Elizabeth's Pollution Protest at the height of the acid rain controversies. We were just beginning to hear about its detrimental effects, and my fellow yearbook geeks wanted to make a statement. Maybe I listened the first time, and that was for my head, and I became aware. In 1994, my young family went on a camping trip to the west coast of Vancouver Island, Pacific Rim National Park Reserve. I had not been paying attention much at all, but my 8-year-old son Jordan had been. He knew we'd be driving right by the site of the protest against harvesting old-growth forests in the Clayoquot Sound. When his little eyes spied the protest camp, he screamed at the top of his lungs, "There it is, Dad! You have to stop the car now!" I was pulling a tent trailer on a very windy road, and I came careening to a stop. He nearly got run over by the traffic because he was out the door before I had the car in park. Was he ever angry that they told him he was too young to sign the petition? He's been a contributor to the World Wildlife Fund since he had his first bank account at the age of 12, and he now works for the National Park, the Canada Parks Canada, as a creator of programs and products, discovery products. His argument, people can't love the earth if they don't know it. So maybe I heard the second time, and that was for my heart, and I was awakened. When I heard of the gruesome discovery in Kamloops last Friday, the bodies of 215 children in a mass unmarked grave, my heart stopped. And I have been unable to think of much else. I realized that colonization not only brought with it a complete disregard for whole cultures and people, colonization brought with it a whole level of disregard for Mother Earth, our home. I'm pretty sure last Friday I felt the third time. And it was for my spirit. It's become part of me. The first story of creation in the scriptures talks about how on the 6th day God created humankind in God's image. With June being Pride Month across the country, this part of the story is pivotal. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness. And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over the cattle and over all the wild animals of the earth." So God created humankind in God's image. In the image of God, they were created. Male and female, they were created. Note the non-binary nature of God. But I also want you to notice that humankind was given dominion. But we were to have dominion in the image and likeness of God, in the way that God would have dominion? And how do we feel about things we create ourselves? So for me, that's a call to faithful stewardship. Now, although we're far from an ideal institution, when the United Church of Canada added a line to our own creed, which calls us to live with respecting creation, we began to give legs by recognizing and supporting environmental causes. In 2015, the church voted to divest completely from fossil fuels and has committed to reducing its own greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050. In 2018, the church started its Faithful Footprints grant program, which offers up to $30,000 to congregations trying to make environmentally friendly renovations to the buildings that they have. We have $3 million in that fund already. And then, formed in 2019, the United Property Resource Corporation was founded by the church, and it prioritizes the development of safe, stable, affordable housing and works in partnership with faith communities across the country, helping us to reimagine our real estate for positive community impact and to meet community housing and social needs. UPRC is committed to delivering 5,000 affordable housing units nationwide by 2037. But not only that, these housing projects are going to be built with net zero standards in those to help combat climate change. And that includes renewable energy, the design of solar-ready projects, geo-exchange heating and cooling, passive ventilation, daylighting, solar heating in the winter, carbon reduction, operational carbon, it will be zero on-site carbon emissions, all electric buildings. We will build with mass timber, low carbon insulation, all that kind of stuff. You know, sometimes the church has been really good at telling governments, businesses, and other nonprofits what it should be doing. We're good at that, raging. But for my part, I think it's just more important for us to be faithful to our own creed. Our relationship with creation is a spiritual matter, calling people of all faiths to ground our practices in a sacred relationship with the ground of our being. And so may God help us as we respond faithfully to this call. May God help us if we don't.
Thank you very much, Reverend Blair. That's a very impactful and moving way to end what you said. I think that is something that from everyone of a faith background on this call would probably feel, is that if we're not able to work together to address this immediately, may God help us with the world that is left over. One of the things that I think is important is the dedication of our elected officials in finding a solution and working towards building a more environmentally conscious and respectful government, as well as community. And on that note, I would like to introduce the next speaker tonight, who is the leader of the Green Party of British Columbia, Sonia Furstenau. She is a good friend and the first BC Green MLA for Cowichan Valley. Sonia serves as the House Leader of the Green Party of BC and currently sits on 6 parliamentary committees, which I'm amazed at given how much she already does for the community. Sonia, on an interesting note, she has a background in history, which is something that I personally wanted to study. And when we look towards our history, we can gain a lot of lessons about what worked in the past and what maybe we need to change. So I'm going to pass it now on to Sonia.
Thank you so much. Yusuf, I'm just going to correct one thing. I no longer sit on 6 committees. I'm not, maybe about 3 or 4 right now, but
no worries.
I'm joining you this evening and this amazing panel from the unceded lands of Cowichan tribes and Malahat Nation. And I am sure, like Reverend Blair, all of us have been reflecting very deeply this last week on the news and the discovery in Kamloops of the bodies of children, of Indigenous children. And I have the very good fortune to work every day in the legislature with my colleague Adam Olson, who's the MLA for Cowichan, or for Sandwich North and the Islands, and also a member of the Sartlet First Nation. And Adam gave a very moving and amazing speech on Monday in response to this. And he and I have been talking all week. I've been calling people up in my riding, elders in Cowichan, speaking with them. And I think, and Suzanne, just listening to you earlier today with your Sierra Club talk, you talked about stories and how stories are so important and so powerful. And I, as a historian, couldn't agree more. And I think where we are right now in Canada as a nation is that the story that we have been telling of ourselves has collided so many times with truths and realities that do not match that story. And the news of a mass grave of children, of Indigenous children, is, I think, one of the hardest and most penetrating truths that now require of us to recognize and let go of the story that we have been telling, that we are a kind and gentle and fair nation, that we are a nation that celebrates diversity, a multicultural nation, that we are a nation that is a nation that other countries around the world look to for our leadership, our peacekeeping, all of this myth of who we are as Canada has now collided so many times with truths that don't fit into that myth. And so where I think we must be in this moment, and it must last for a while. And we must also recognize that more truths are coming. And these are truths that have been already told for decades by Indigenous people. And so for Adam and for everybody, every Indigenous person I've talked to in the last week, this isn't a new truth. This is a reminder of truths that have been carried generation over generation. And this story of Canada as a social construct also is parallel with the story of Canada as an environmental construct. The beautiful, supernatural British Columbia, the leadership of Canada on environmental fronts, that story is also colliding with truths that make it impossible to continue to hold on to that myth. And these two stories are parallel and they are deeply intertwined. That our history of colonizing, our history of displacing Indigenous people from their lands and their communities, of removing children, is absolutely entwined with our history of how we have treated the land and the resources and the natural systems and the ecosystems. And so here we are in this moment when we know we are not leaders on climate change action. In fact, we are one of the greatest laggards. We are deeply subsidizing an oil and gas industry in this country. We know we're not leaders in sustainable management of our lands, our forests. We know we're not leaders in protecting water even though we have some of the largest reserves of fresh water in the world, we have treated it as though it doesn't matter. And what we can now do with these truths that undermine these stories that we've been telling is we can say, we must now begin to write a new story for the future. And that new story must be honest and must be truthful and must incorporate the truth of our past. But to move us from where we are right now, that intertwining of the dispossession and colonization of Indigenous people and the treatment of our land and our environment, the path forward is one that pulls this together and recognizes that for us to become the nation that we want to be proud of, it is Indigenous people and communities and nations that we must turn to for the leadership in how we have an environment that is sustainable and healthy and keeps all of us sustainable and healthy. And so I think today's conversation about the environment must not in any way be dislocated or dislodged from our conversation about colonialism. And use of the conversation that you are facilitating about anti-racism, about bringing us all together, because we will write a better story if we are writing it together. I'm going to tell a couple of very short stories about myself and how I've arrived at where I am. My first time up Mount Robson was when I was 2 years old in the back of my dad's backpack. And there were several other times in my childhood that we climbed to the top of that mountain. My dad never brought a camera. And I asked him about it once, and he said, when I can't picture it anymore, then I know it's time to go back. And I have these deeply embedded memories of hearing the sound of running water when we're sleeping next to a creek running down that mountain and feeling like I'd come home. We spent my childhood outdoors as much as possible on mountains, in forests, camping, skiing, everything. And then when I had my first son, he's 26 now, I spent a lot of time in the forest with him. And one day he asked me, how old will you be when you die? And Suzanne, I thought about this story when I was listening to you today. And I said, I will be very, very old, maybe 100. And 4-year-old Nicholas says, oh, well, then you'll be like a nurse log, because your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren will be growing out of you, and you'll be part of us. I think we understand our connection to nature and the environment. I think of course, it's in us. We unlearn it because we are told stories that separate us. We are told stories that we can't possibly have protection of our environment and a healthy economy, so we have to make a choice. I don't believe that story. I can't believe that in 2021, we can't imagine ways of having a healthy economy without a healthy environment. I can't believe we lack that imagination collectively. And one of the reasons that I have found myself in politics where I never imagined I would be was because of a threat to our community's health and well-being with the permit for a contaminated landfill for 5 million tons of soil to be put at the headwaters of our drinking watershed in Shawnigan Lake. And I just thought, I can't stand by and let this happen. But while I joined with the community and built community and rooted our efforts in love for our water, our lake, our community, each other, I realized that there were structural issues at the provincial level that were contributing to these outcomes. And one of those was something called professional reliance. And that led me to want to run for office and reform that, which I'm proud to say is one of the things I've been a participant in. There is a new Professional Governance Act, which ensures that the kinds of conflict of interest that led to what happened in Shawnigan shouldn't be happening anywhere else. But then once I became an MLA, I started to recognize that our political system, the way that we do governance, isn't equipped to meet the urgent issues and crises that we face today. Our politics is for the most part divorced from the past and unconnected to the future that we are shaping with every single decision that we make. Our politics operates on sometimes a 4-year cycle, sometimes even shorter. And we have lost the connection that we need, that Suzanne talks about, that exists, as we all know and feel when we go into an intact forest. The connections that exist in nature. Everything touches everything else and has an impact on everything else. It is the same in politics. And yet we divide everything up into jurisdictions and silos and different ministries. And we make decisions as though they exist in isolation from the past, and more importantly, from the future, and from every other decision that's being made. And so the reason that I ultimately made the choice to run for a leadership role is because I think we need to model and demonstrate a different kind of political existence, and one that really is rooted in connectedness, because we cannot solve the environmental, social justice crises that we face right now by continuing to do things the same way that we've always done them. So, on that note, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this discussion and panel this evening.
Thank you so much, Sonia. I appreciate your words and your voice. What we hope to accomplish here, it touches on exactly what you were saying, which is, what are the new ways to accomplish a better world? Because the old ways in the old power systems and the old structures, they were leading us in a direction of destruction, of self-destruction. So to let go of that, I think for many people, it should become a joyful thing, that the ways of the old that were impacting our world and our communities negatively, we can just let them go, and we can build a better world together with leaders and with experts and with caring people who want to see the world heal and grow and prosper. And as you touched on it, our First Nations communities have a lot to teach us in respect to how to do that within our locations. They've done it for thousands and thousands of years, each generation improving upon the next. And we have to learn from that. We have to learn from our history here. Now, to bring us to our next speaker, I would like to introduce Dr. Suzanne Simard from the University of British Columbia. She's a professor and forest ecologist. She's also a pioneer on the frontier of plant communication and intelligence. Her work has influenced ecologists, filmmakers, and her TED Talks, which I've seen and they're awesome, have been viewed by more than 10 million people across the world. Dr. Simard brings us to the intimate world of trees, sharing the fascinating and really the vital truths that trees are not just simply sources of timber or pulp, but are complicated, interdependent circles of life. And they are really the backbone of forest ecosystems. They're social, they're cooperative creatures that are connected through underground networks, which was fascinating to learn about because it shows that they're communities just like we are. They have vitality, they have friends, they have vulnerabilities, and their communal lives are ultimately not that different than our own. Dr. Simard's first book just came out. It's called Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest. It's based on her more than 30 years of studying relationships between trees and their ecosystems and how they're all connected as a society in the forest. I would encourage everyone to check it out. And if I'm not mistaken, there should be a film adaptation of that in the works starring Amy Adams. So congratulations, that's wonderful. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much for having me. What an incredible forum here. I love Blair's talk. I love Sonia's talk. I love what everybody is saying. And I hope I can contribute, my perspective. And I think that it dovetails with what everyone is saying. So I actually prepared some slides, but I'm just going to speak. So I'm actually in Nelson, British Columbia right now. This is where I live. I'm on the unceded territory of the Ktunaxa, the Sinixt, and the Okanagan nations. I actually grew up in Kamloops. I went to school there, which is in the unceded territory of the Secwepemc Nation. And I lived across the river from that residential school. And it's heartbreaking. And I feel ashamed, to be honest. I come from a French Canadian family. We emigrated from France, emigrated across Canada, and settled in the Enderby area, which was in the Splatsin Nation, which is part of the Secwepemc, a tribe within the Secwepemc. And I was a kid when that residential school was operating. It closed in 1969 as an overnight residential school. So I was 9 years old when it closed. But I remember, there were First Nations kids in my school. But of course, First Nations kids went to that other school as well. And we didn't know much about it, except that I remember, and I'm just telling you this from my heart, my sister Robin had friends in the school. I didn't. And she came home one night, she went over and stayed overnight. And she said, "Mom, all those kids were crying." And we still were so ignorant, And so here it was, happening right with us. And we didn't learn about it in school. It was removed from us, even though it was all happening right underneath our very lives. And I hope that we've learned. I hope we learn from this experience. I hope we move forward. I hope we create a better reality for everybody that's inclusive of all communities of faith, all communities of color, all communities of nations, because the painful past is really hard to live through, and it's really hard to move forward, but we have to. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my story. That is a really painful thing for me to come to terms with. My family, as I said, settled in the Splatsin Nation area. We were French Canadian, even though I grew up in Kamloops. But I spent all my summers at this place that was in the Splatsin Nation territory. And my family, as with many colonist family, were given land along the Shuswap River, which is now called the Shuswap River. And all the Splatsin Nation people were moved onto a 200-acre piece of land, a reserve, to provide homesteads for European families. And I don't think that my French Canadian family came to terms with that. They certainly didn't talk about it. We certainly never talked about it. But my family were horse loggers, and so they logged in this area. And prior to, the nations were around. They fished from the Shuswap River. They had weirs. I didn't see them, but those weirs were for fishing for salmon. They were very special fishing technologies. Those weirs were set up, in rivers throughout British Columbia, because British Columbia when I grew up, it was a province of old growth forests and salmon rivers. Now it's a province of clear cuts and rivers that have very little salmon left in them. And it's because we basically outlawed those amazing fishing technologies. The weirs, where they could count the fish and then adapt if there weren't good migrations that year, reduce the harvest. There were in the Fraser River It wasn't weirs, but they used spears and dip nets to fish for the salmon, to just, take what they needed. And I remember, working, I got a job later when I was a young forester, and the First Nations and I worked in Lillooet, and they were harvesting salmon. And I remember them drying the salmon along the river, but I really still didn't really know much. And then I eventually, became a forester, and I witnessed what was so different than what my family did. My family were horse loggers, so they just took the odd tree here and there. But they were really the beginning, right? They were, even though my great grandfather, my grandfather, my uncles, my dad, they weren't exploiting the forest, at least not from my eye. They were taking out the odd white pine and the odd cedar. But then when I became a forester, I entered into this era of rampant clear cutting. The exploitation was astounding. I was only in my early 20s, but I grew up in the forest, in intact rainforests. And what I saw was a destruction of those rainforests and replacing them with plantations that were sick. They were getting sicker all the time, because not only were we taking these old forests, or, this colonist attitude of exploitation, taking these old growth forests, but we were replacing them with these simplified, purified, cleansed plantations, free of native plants, just like our society was trying to free itself of the native children. It's the same thing. You're right, Sonia. It's the same thing. And I was so fortunate that, even though I wasn't working with First Nations people at the time, I knew in my heart that this was wrong, right? That we were disconnecting the land, and it was a connected place. I knew that in my heart. I think we all know that. And so I started studying connections in forests to try to figure out what the heck are we doing wrong. And eventually, and that's when I learned about these below ground webs, right? That the fungi that linked the forest together. And it just made sense to me, because the forest is a place where there's so much going on. It's so sophisticated. It's not just about competing and dominating and being the winner. It's about collaborating and working together and facilitating each other and being companions and being resilient, because we all work together and our network together. The forest does that, right? Just like our own communities need to do that. And eventually, I published this work in the journal Nature, but there was this huge backlash, because, like, as Sonia talked about, there is this huge infrastructure already in place to hold those pillars of discrimination, of exploitation in place to favor a few. It's really hard to break those policies and laws, because they're so solid, they're so entrenched. There's whole economies built around them to sustain those things. And so when I brought out my work and said, it's not just about, getting rid of plants you don't want, we need the whole forest to go through its natural successional process, I couldn't break those policies by myself. And so there was a huge backlash. And eventually I left the ministry. I was working for the Ministry of Forests, so I know how government works. And I went into academia, and I was able to pursue my research. And eventually I got to work with some First Nations people. And my whole world opened up, even though I'd been trying to understand, and trying to convey to my colleagues, to the people that were running the forest, to the industry, the government, that we were disconnecting the forest to our detriment, that it was actually ripping these forests apart, and it was ripping us apart, that we were losing biodiversity and carbon and clean water and our air. And, we were on this downward spiral where we should have been on an upward spiral, right? Where we're meant to soar, and yet we were falling, and we still are. But I know that there's a way out of this. And so let me talk about that a little bit. So I started working with a First Nations woman who I work with a lot now. Her name is Dr. Teresa Ryan, Simhayex. She's Tsimshian Nation, and she's a salmon fishery scientist. And she told me the stories of in her villages in the Tsimshian Nation, of which there are many tribes, 6, I think, that the Tlingit, the Kaida, the Haltzik, the Kwakwak, they use what were called tidal stone traps to fish for salmon. So they're all salmon communities. They depend on salmon. They call themselves people of the salmon or people of the cedar. the salmon, the forest are all intimately linked together. And she has taught me about these tidal stone traps and how they're all along our coastline. Most people don't know about them, but to me, they're like the eighth wonder of the world. When you look at them from satellite imagery, there are these beautiful contours along our coastline that the First Nations built over thousands of years. And the way they worked is that on the ebb tide, the salmon would get trapped behind these stone walls that they had built over thousands of years. They would get trapped behind them, and they would passively fish for some of the salmon for their food, but they always threw the big mothers back. And they threw the big mothers back into the ocean so that they could produce eggs for bigger babies. And that would keep the population strong and alive and thriving. And they kept track, right? They kept track of the variability. And so when the salmon populations were low, when the runs were low, they didn't fish as much. And they would always let the big mothers go up and spawn in the fall. And so they were very much attuned and built up those salmon populations through their ingenious indigenous science. And, you know, when the salmon went to spawn, the bears and the eagles and the wolves and the cougars would pick up some of those salmon, the ravens, and take them into the forest. And they would eat some of them under these big old trees, what I'm calling mother trees, what they call grandmother trees, which the Shepwamek, Mary Thomas of the Shepwamek Nation, called the mother trees. And the salmon decay, and then the nitrogen in that salmon ends up being picked up by these mycorrhizal networks, which I studied so much, these connections that connect all trees together. And that salmon is picked up by these fungi and it ends up in the trees, right? It ends up in the trees. The actual nitrogen of the salmon is in the tree rings for thousands and thousands of years. And we can actually reconstruct salmon population densities by looking at the nitrogen N15 in those tree rings. And my guess is that, and we haven't done this, but we want to do this, is that when colonization happened and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans took over that salmon fishery, took that resource away from the First Nations, and they dismantled those and outlawed those ancient tidal stone traps and said, we're going to do it ourselves. And look what has happened to our salmon populations since then. They've gone like this, right? And what we're trying to do is go back and say, let's reconstruct those old technologies. Let's bring them back. Let's watch what happens to those resources when we manage them with respect. When we don't take everything, we don't take every tree, we don't take every salmon, we don't take every bear. We just take what we need with respect. And so I learned this in a much deeper way, just from my own Western science. I learned it through Indigenous eyes, because now I'm working almost a lot with a lot of different First Nations. And this is how they honor the land, as though they're one with it, right? And there's many words and all these nations that say we are one. Netsamatst is one of the Coast Salish words. And so we have this in us. Like Sonia said, it's in our DNA to know this stuff, that we are all connected together, that we are just part of nature. I don't believe that man is the dominion over nature. I believe that man is one with nature, that the trees are our brothers and sisters, as are the wolves and the bears, and we need to treat them with equal respect, just like we do with each other. And it's through these webs of resilience that is how we are wired to heal, how we are wired to thrive, and we just need to reconnect ourselves with each other, with the forest, and we will. I believe that we have it in us to recover and find a better way. I've seen it. I see it in the First Nations. I know that nature is wired that way. I think we can do it. So with that, thank you so much for having me, and it's an honor, so much an honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. Like the passion with which you speak, and it was infectious. I'm going to take Sonia's advice, and I'm going to listen to that podcast as soon as I can and get the book. Because guys, what we need to do is we need to support people who are like Dr. Simard, doing the work to help educate us about what is really going on and what the hidden history of the forests are, what their lives are like, what their communities are like. I will say that in a lot of the work that we do, we take the mindset of being silo busters. I know Tark loves that that phrase, to break down silos of community so that we can support one another in the good work that we're doing. And I will say that the work that you're doing in particular, Suzanne, like to bring awareness that, when I first heard it, my mind was blown that such things are true, that their communities, they're really, maybe people is a stretch, but like they have, feelings and growth and history, the history of the forest. I'm really grateful for that. And again, thank you so much. I do want to apologize to everyone. Our next speaker scheduled for today, Mufti Asim Rashid, he's actually in Australia and he was having some technical difficulties, so he's not able to join. But what I'll do is I'll speak on behalf of some of maybe the Muslim perspective on the environment, and again, like how we try to see things and approach it from a faith perspective. So just a quick intro to myself, I guess. My name is Yusuf Siraj. I'm a Assistant General Secretary for the BC Muslim Association, as well as with the Muslim Care Center and, of course, Islam Unravelled. In 2015, scholars, policymakers, and academics from across the Muslim world came together in Turkey to issue what was called the Islamic Declaration on Climate. So we had our faith leaders, our academic experts and scholars actually come together to have a unified declaration from the Muslim and Islamic world, which is that the scientific consensus on climate change is proven, it's real, it's caused by humans, and it has to be addressed at a global to local level. The need to act with clear targets and monitoring systems was recommended, and the dire consequences of not doing so was highlighted from both a scientific as well as a spiritual perspective. Going right back to the initial communities of Muslims who grew up in a desert environment, right? So the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the initial believers, they were in what is modern day Saudi Arabia, but back then would have just been Arabia. And in the harshness of that climate, the incredible difficulty of life, where if everything revolved around water, it revolved around your relationship, your understanding, and your humility towards engaging with nature. That entire experience really impacted our Islamic approach towards ecology, towards the environment, towards ecosystems. There's a saying of the Prophet that even if you live by a rushing river, just take what you need, don't take too much. And for people to really internalize the messages within their faith, to become the standard bearers for climate change aversion, we have to shift. So who are the people if not ourselves? That's something that always runs through my mind. When I read the Quran, which is the Muslim holy book, and I see God saying to people that we sent you as stewards of the earth. So a slight difference than our Christian brothers and sisters and friends. In Islam, the concept is khalifa, which means to be a steward. You are responsible. You are entrusted with. It's called an imana, which is something that has a practical as well as spiritual as well as legal meaning towards it. So every community has a trust, and that trust is not just something for them to take care of, but to ensure that it is passed on to the next generation. What we're seeing today, and what some of our next speakers will touch on, is the importance of transitioning from a mindset that someone else will do it, that it is important, but someone else can do it, or that it is important, it is part of our faith, but there's other priorities, that there's other things to do, towards a mindset that this is a moral imperative. It is something that if we are not actively taking personal, family, social, community, national, and international steps towards addressing, then we will, in effect, bring upon, to use religious terminology, we would bring upon a judgment upon ourselves by our own actions. So the Quran, when talking about moral or social mistakes that people do, it's always unrepentant, wanton sinning. When a person goes so much beyond the pale and we start to see greed reach epidemic levels. As faith leaders and as a faith community, we have to be at the forefront of saying, we should not do this, we won't do this. We have to take what we need. We have to be conscious of others' rights. And I would say first and foremost, the First Nations rights. Our masjids cannot hold legal prayers on stolen land. So we have done a lot of work through the BCMA as well as through Islam Unravelled to help to rectify that, that historical injustice. In addition to that, when I'm talking with a lot of the youth in the Muslim community, and our next speaker, Miriam, she's going to touch on this in more detail, but I see the demand, the yearning from a youth as well as a spiritual perspective that we need to connect with our morals, enable our communities to be able at the forefront of making this change, whether it's political, whether it's activist, whether it's education, providing resources, or standing in solidarity with our allies. That it can no longer just be something that is accepted but not acted upon. I would say that the Muslim community of British Columbia is blessed to be here, where we can have access to water, where it's not like we're in the Middle East or in the deserts of Arabia, where every single day is a struggle for life and people gain an appreciation. However, I will say that as faith communities, if we are not careful, then that difficult life will be not just some parts of the world, but everywhere. And I don't think as stewards of this earth, as inheritors from previous generations, and as the people responsible to passing on this planet to our future generations, that would be something that we would want to do. So that's just a brief perspective to talk practically about what Muslim youth are doing, as well as looking at it from a perspective of active change. I'm going to pass it on to our next speaker, Miriam Noor-Vahid. She is the chairperson of Green Ummah. Ummah means community. Green Ummah is a nonprofit organization with the goal of creating this green movement within the Canadian Muslim community. Miriam served as a member on the governing council of the University of Toronto, and through her advocacy and nonprofit work, she has driven the conversation forward on diverse issues, including mental health, civic engagement, how they tie in with the environment. And again, thank you for being here, Miriam. Thank you. I know it's a bit late in Toronto, but we really appreciate it. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And first of all, I want to start by saying thank you to everyone for your profound insights and stories. I feel like I've been sitting here and learning a lot, but also been very touched by everything that you've shared. And I really appreciate that vulnerability. So thank you. I'm coming to you from the region of Peel, which is part of the Treaty Lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. I want to echo what everyone else has said about Kamloops. It's something that, unfortunately, knowing our ongoing, the ongoing impacts of colonialism in Canada, that came as no surprise to me, but was absolutely heartbreaking to hear of regardless. And just to quickly say that a movement towards environmental justice must include collaboration with Indigenous peoples in Canada. So I want to begin with that, and now I will get started. Today I want to answer three questions for you. The first is, why did we decide to start Green Ummah, this nonprofit that's so focused on Canadian Muslims? The second is, what is so important about engaging Canadian Muslims on the environment? And the third is, what is so important to us about engaging Muslim youth? And I'll talk a little bit about why that's going to be our focus for the next couple of years. So first of all, on Green Ummah, pre-COVID, and this seems like a dream now, we were sitting around my dining room table downstairs, myself and a couple of friends, and we had all come from a Muslim community organizing background, and we were kind of surprised that we hadn't heard a lot about engaging Canadian Muslims on the environment at a national level. There was some work done. It didn't feel like it had reached any of us, and we all had come from different backgrounds, not environmental science by any means, but we had a shared passion for the environment and for knowing what we know about our faith, Islam, and what it says about the environment. And through sharing our stories, we decided to start this nonprofit, Green Ummah, which very much is trying to move towards a more inclusive movement towards environmental justice. Our focus is on engaging, educating, and empowering Canadian Muslims to become change makers in the environmental movement, with that focus on environmental justice. So why is it so important for us to engage Canadian Muslims in the environment? First of all, as Brother Yusuf said so well, that, you know, in our Quran, in our faith, it talks about how we are the Khalifa of the earth. And this word has many meanings. It means that we are the deputy, the guardian, the friend, the steward of the earth. And so it's something that's actually embedded in Islam, that we have this religious obligation to balance into a respectful relationship with our world. And that's something that I think we should be paying attention to. There are over 1 million Muslims in Canada, and many of us actually, especially in Ontario, we live in key ridings that could influence the outcomes of election. And I say that point because I think that we have huge potential to make a difference for the environment, and that includes politically. So that's really important to me. And I think that if we engage Muslims through a faith-based approach on the environment, that could serve as a really important piece of inspiration for many. Just this May, we actually held the first National Muslim Conference on the environment, Greening Our Community Conference. And one of the things that we heard from a participant who reached out to us was that she'd been trying to engage her husband on the environment for years, and he was not listening. He didn't seem like he cared. But after listening to our panel about Islam and the environment, for the first time, he actually really started to listen and do research on his own about how he could become part of the environmental movement. So that really shows the significance of a faith-based approach for many Muslims. On the final question, why have we decided to focus on Muslim youth? I want to start by saying that if we want to address the climate and biodiversity crises we face, we need to recognize the assets that we bring to the table. We all have assets, and that is something that is so important. When I was studying at the University of Toronto, and I've just graduated, which is very exciting, I remember a classmate actually pointing out to me these decorative shrubs next to Sid Smith, which is one of our buildings. And she was like, hey, that's actually a community garden. And I was so shocked. I thought they were decorative. I never really paid any attention to them, and shocked that my fellow students had taken on such meaningful, creative, environmental work that I would have never noticed without her pointing out. For me, the simple act of noticing was transformative. And this is one of the moments where I felt inspired to take on that greater role in the environmental movement, because, you know, I know that for many others, noticing might actually also be transformative for them and get them to engage. I tell you this story because it's important to me, and it was a powerful lesson in two ways. First, it's that people are already doing the work. Many people on the panel are already doing the work. Many people in your communities are already doing the work. And so if you're interested in the environment, notice what's going on. Like, just take a look around and see what's happening. And you might be surprised at what you found and might find a place for you to join. And the second reason is because youth are powerful. We are creative, we're innovative. People my age have been experimenting with like hydroponics and rooftop gardens, and that's just the beginning. We need to recognize these assets that we bring to the table. And maybe you don't have a knowledge of the environment, and I think that's totally okay. As has been said before, this needs to have global participation in the environmental movement. And so whatever it is that you specialize in, if it's community advocacy, if it's law, if it's engineering, those are all, you know, different important parts of this environmental movement that we need to consider and include. I'm going to end by speaking a bit about what the work is that we're doing. So knowing what we know about Muslim youth, our next couple of years is shaped around our upcoming project, which is called the Greening Our Communities Toolkit. We've been working with educational consultants and with the support of Nature Canada to develop this first of its kind toolkit, which is targeted towards Muslim youth and focuses on 4 central questions. What does it mean to be green? What shapes how we think about our environment? What can we learn about Islam from being green? And how can you become a change maker in the environmental movement? And my hope is that through this toolkit, we'll be able to take people through that same journey that I went through, from noticing your environment, noticing why you think about the environment in certain ways. And so a little bit of that work of recognizing how, you know, Eurocentric beliefs actually very much influence how we engage with the environment. And then also moving towards recognizing the assets that we carry and how we can use that to help shape our communities and really, radically include a perspective of sustainability and balance and respect for the environment in everything that we do. Our focus of this toolkit is to empower. We know that people bring assets, and I really, if you're interested in, paying attention and interested in learning more about yourself and the environment around you, please feel free to follow us at Greenema, and our toolkit will hopefully be released in the next couple of months. So that's what I had to say, and I really hope you learn from it. And once again, I just want to say thank you so much to everyone for giving me this space.
Thank you, Mariam, for your leadership and the energetic approach that you bring to this issue. It's so important. And one of the terms that Tark and I really love is the term reverse mentorship, where youth leaders, thought leaders, and activists such as yourself and such as anyone with that passion for changing the world and how they can help us from previous generations with their wisdom and their knowledge. I think it's super important. And again, congrats on the toolkit, the upcoming toolkit. Those are practical, awesome solutions to really help individuals and families and communities to shift behavior, to shift actions. So as soon as that's ready, we'll help promote that. We'll get it out there with you. And God bless you, and thank you very much for participating tonight. Now, our next speaker is a good friend and someone who's done awesome work for many years in empowering youth. So transitioning nicely, we have Kyle Imperingham. So Kyle is a co-founder of the Starfish Canada, which actually organizes the top 25 environmentalists under 25 program. And this helps to inspire young Canadians to take leadership roles in their community, as well as to celebrate their peers who are contributing to the environmentalism movement. Alongside his role there at Starfish Canada, Kyle also serves on the board of City Hive, which is an organization that empowers youth engagement in city activities, including civic planning, shaping, and decision-making. So really helping to build the current and future leaders of Canada. Kyle, please.
Wonderful. Thanks, Yusuf. For the clarity of City Hive, they would be mad at me maybe if I didn't clarify that I was a former board director and helped them launch their nonprofit, and actually founded by 2 top 25 environmentalists under 25 winners. So I'll clarify that, but I'm very proud to be an alum of City Hive for sure. I'll say a few things to start. One, happy Pride. It's Pride Month, and want to recognize that in this conversation as well, as we're talking about the intersections of environmentalism. And really hope that everyone feels the joy that I can feel to be able to express myself in the way that I choose to. I also want to acknowledge it is also National Indigenous History Month, and I will acknowledge that I'm on the territory of the Lekwungen peoples, known as the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. And I've written notes, and I think we're all starting the same way, which is a fantastic form of solidarity, spirit, and action, talking about the tragic events that have happened in the last weeks with the 215 children found in that Kamloops residential school. And the way I want to start this is by considering what has been revealed in the last little while, and to be frank with you, probably more revelations of that are to come down the road. I think we need to acknowledge that. And I think also one of the pieces that I really want to bring into this conversation in a provocative but mindful manner is that I kind of think it's time to say goodbye to a traditional form of environmentalism that we've held so dear for so long. In North America, we started caring for the planet because we wanted to conserve space for its natural beauty. That's how a lot of elements of conservation and environmentalism started. It's the foundation of why some of the founding fathers wanted to make sure some spaces didn't get developed. It's a noble effort. I don't think that should necessarily go away. It's a necessary part of what we need to do as a species to thrive and to make sure that we can coexist on this planet. We have evolved our thinking since then. Of course, we've understood that natural spaces have great benefits for people. That there's a thing called nature deficit disorder, and that we understand that being outdoors has a lot of health benefits, capping the screen time as well. Even during the nature of a pandemic, we have now realized that Zoom fatigue is real, and there are things that we need to do in order to make sure that we can get outside and enjoy the absolute wonders of nature. So in a way, we've added a psychology of sustainability that illustrates how nature benefits us. Also, an incredible thing. We live on this planet, And we certainly need to find better ways to coexist with the planet that is giving us the life that we have. But I do think we're at this big and pivotal juncture in our work as environmental leaders. I wouldn't say intersections are necessarily a new way of thinking, but I think we've now understood how essential they are to finding a solution that has genuine resilience, is able to support people and the planet that we care so deeply about. And to be honest with you, I'm really excited about that, about how I think we're coming to more almost an awakening in a sense of how important that is. I don't think the environmental nonprofit sector, which is where most of my work has lived, I don't think we've been necessarily a laggard in that sector about understanding those intersections and the need for diversity, equity, and inclusion in our conversations. But I do think it's time for us to accelerate. We of course need policy in order to make that happen, but we don't need to push paper at a bureaucratic pace in order to make sure that we can sustain some of the actions that we need to take. I do think we need to listen deeply, and we need to act, and we need to act again, and then we need to listen more, and then we need to act some more. And we need to sustain that pace to create better systems that bring the voices of marginalized and underrepresented groups to the forefront and keep them there. To be honest, it's why my co-founder, Sujani Kandasamy, and myself started the Starfish Canada 10 years ago. That's what we were seeing. We were seeing a need for young voices to be heard. And 10 years later, we're still pushing for a lot of those changes today, but we can tell that the landscape certainly has changed. We're still here because we want to show that young people aren't just the leaders of tomorrow, they're also the leaders of today. Their insights, their innovations, their young minds are what we need to find solutions that can actually bridge this intersection of social and environmental justice and everything that comes with that. From an organizational perspective, of course, we're a collection of people, and as any collection of people should be doing right now, we consistently think about how we show up in the world, how we provide space to make sure that those that are systemically left out of conversations are now in the conversation and a valued and equitable voice in that conversation. We naturally do that work for young people. That's sort of the name of the game for us, but we also know we still need to do that with the deepest of intentionality. I'm really proud of how the team has rallied behind this. We've actually hired for multiple equity-oriented roles. We have a diversity, equity, inclusion manager, and also on our marketing team, many people have some form of diversity, equity, or inclusion in the nature of their title. In marketing and communications, many other people are holding pieces of that portfolio. And I think that's the nature of the work that we know we need to do moving forward, but need to vocalize it and say it and bang the table a little bit on, is that DE&I work can't simply live in one person's portfolio, and it certainly shouldn't. While I applaud how many times I've seen people who are now chief diversity officers at Fortune 500 companies and things like that, it's a great step. And there's many steps that we need to take. One of the things I've learned along the way is that this work is a journey, not a destination. And so we need to take a step, and then we need to know that we're going to take many steps in that direction as well. I'm really proud of the Starfish Canada and the team that has sort of rallied around this work. And I'm proud that they all know that this work is not one person's portfolio. Everyone has space in this, and everyone's welcome to the conversation. And like that famous quote, they're also invited to the dance as well. I want to leave with a thought that I sort of had that ties in well with the start. I'm going to see if I can. I cannot share my screen, but that's okay. I will read this quote because I was going to do it anyway. I want to give the credit to Larissa Crawford and the incredible people at Future Ancestors. If you don't know who they are, I certainly welcome you to look them up and make sure that you follow them on social media, where they do a lot of incredible work, and they have services as well that you can reach out to them for. This is a quote from Larissa Crawford, who is one of their founders. We are asked often about our work and how it aligns with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Before answering, we always provide a detailed response about how our work aligns with the Truth and Reconciliation 94 calls to action. Any effort to pursue the UN SDGs and what is currently Canada must be led by the context of, history of, and responsibility to the TRC calls to action. That it still gives me a little shivers actually as I say it, because I think that it's one of these things that we've understood as environmentalists and as people who want to do incredible work in the world, that, you know, there's certainly frameworks that we need in order to do it. That's sort of where the Sustainable Development Goals came in, and they are certainly holistic in many senses. To bring it into the Canadian context, into the context that we live in, into the world that we're living in now, something like the TRC calls to action are exactly the sort of response that we need to be thinking about as environmental leaders, and show people exactly, yeah, we can work on Sustainable Development Goals and we could work on calls to action at the same time. These things don't live in silos, they intersect, and that means that we can work on them, and we will work on them together. I'm looking forward to the conversation that's going to continue throughout this session. I really appreciate the invitation. And Yusuf, I will pass it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle, very much. And again, you know, a very humble man, but the work he's doing is transformative. And part of that transformation and that outcome is helping to highlight the roles and the history and stories of youth leaders such as our next speaker, who is actually one of the top 25 under 25 environmentalists that Starfish Canada helped to empower and support. So Abhijit Singh Sachal is an environmentalist and activist from Surrey, British Columbia. He has been involved in various organizations and was inspired to co-found an organization called Break the Divide Foundation after he traveled to the Arctic. And this is awesome, on a Students on Ice expedition back in 2016. Through Break the Divide, youth from around the world are connected to discuss prominent issues facing their communities, such as climate change. Abby is also an avid public speaker, and some cool facts, a hockey player and a pianist. So, you know, a well-rounded young man with an amazing contribution here. And I'd like to give you the opportunity to share your voice with us tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much, Yusuf. I appreciate the kind words, and really to echo the sentiments of everyone before. This is such an honor to be here and to be discussing anti-racism, the environment, reconciliation, and what that all means together. So my talk is really focused on hope, empathy, and connection in this time of climate crisis, and what it means to be in the space that we're at right now. I'm 19 years old, so I'll talk from a youth perspective. And a fun fact here, Miriam is actually about 2 years senior to me at the University of Toronto as well. So it's great to see how small of a world this is here. And I guess I'll begin with a bit of my story. I'm really someone who has been connected with the environment for a long time. And a lot of that is rooted in faith for me. And I'll talk about that. And so I grew up here in BC. I'm in Surrey on the unceded territory of the Tsawwassen, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coast Salish First Peoples, who have been here since time immemorial. And I grew up with this connection to the environment. I remember going out for walks here in Watershed Park while it's nice and sunny days, but it's somewhat cloudy and it's that perfect level of mist. And it smells amazing outside. And those in BC will know that. I think we had a day like that yesterday here in the Lower Mainland. And I remember just experiencing this connection to nature. And so as I was in elementary school and high school, I began to learn about climate change, and I started doing presentations to elementary school students about climate change. And so fast forward to when I'm 14 years old, I get this amazing opportunity to travel to Arctic Canada. I was in the Arctic for 2 weeks as a part of the Students on Ice expedition. And that was when things really changed for me. I went in thinking, first of all, I went in telling people that I would be going on this expedition to solve climate change, which in retrospect is an amazing aspiration. And I remember just being in this place where I saw climate change firsthand. I saw ice melting in front of my eyes. There was this one moment that I like to tell people. I was at the Ilulissat Ice Fjord in Greenland, where all I see is ice stretched out for kilometers and kilometers, as far as your eye can see. And all 200 people on this expedition with me, so these are scientists, historians, musicians, and other students like me, we all went silent for a moment. And in that silence, we could hear icebergs melting. And so it's millions of drops of the purest water on the planet going into the freshest body of water that exists. And at 14 years old, I was inundated with feelings of hopelessness. Like, if the scale of the climate crisis is this bad that I can't do anything about it. And what added on this was learning from my Inuit peers about the impacts of climate change and colonialism on their own communities. And I learned that not only had residential schools destroyed their way of life, but climate change has also completely changed their lives. Not for the past 5 years, though, but for the past 20 and 30 years, where they have been seeing the impacts of climate change that we're now just beginning to see. And so I was wondering what I could do, and I recognized that strength and resilience in my peers, that their communities had combated or had been adapting to the impacts of climate change. And I came back home just feeling this frustration that in my own education, I had never learned about the impacts of climate change in my own country. I never known that when some elders in their communities go out hunting, they don't come back because ice patterns have changed so much that traditional knowledge about seasons and ice is no longer as valid. Like I had no idea that that was a problem. And so what I really wanted to do was create a form of connection. So students like me could learn about the impacts of climate change in a way where we could foster empathy. And I started Break the Divide alongside my older brother, Sukhmeet, who was actually speaking at the next panel. And what we decided to do was such a simple idea. It was just to do a Zoom call between my high school in Delta, BC, with a school in Inuvik in the Northwest Territories. And it was a very simple idea. We were doing Zoom calls way before they were cool to do so. And in this video call, students learned about each other. They talked about their experiences with the environment. They talked about climate change and the impacts that it's had on their own communities. And what we realized there is that climate change was no longer a big abstract issue that students felt like they could do nothing about. Rather, they were connected and they understood that they could make a change at their local community level. And when I talk about this feeling of not being able to make change, as I mentioned in the beginning, I've been doing presentations to quite a few elementary school students now, and now I feel like I'm on the older side of youth activism. And as I talk to younger students, I ask them how they feel about climate change specifically. And the most common response is that young people feel anxious, stressed, nervous, and scared about what they want to do and what their futures will look like. And what I've realized is that to move from that space of apathy or even in some cases denial about the issue of climate change, where we see that people's employment may be linked to an industry that climate action threatens. And so what we see there is that to move from this place of denial, apathy, or even extreme polarization about the issue of climate change, what we need to do is to move from a space of apathy to empathy. And we can do that through conversation, through connection, and move that empathy to a space of action. So we move from apathy to empathy to action. I know it sounds really cool too. And we do that through connection, and we do that by connecting people. And at Break the Divide, we started as a small project between two schools, and with the support of amazing supporters like the Starfish Canada, we've been able to expand globally. And what we've seen is that when students come together, when young people connect around the basis of climate change, they feel less of that anxiety and hopelessness, and they feel like they can create change. So what I want to leave everyone with is this idea that connection and hope are critical, especially during these times of layering crises. What we see in terms of reconciliation and anti-racism initiatives need to be incorporated into the environmental movement so that we can connect people and have them understand on the basis of not just the environment, but how those things connect to real people. For me, that's always been the thing that grounds me. I remember in September of 2020 now, as wildfires ravaged the western coast of the United States, smoke came up here in BC. And it was a Monday morning. It was the second week of September, and I was in town because I couldn't go back to university because of the pandemic. It was all online, and I went outside of my home here in Surrey, and I looked outside, and all I could see was smoke. I couldn't go outside for a run. I couldn't go outside for a walk. And that brought back those feelings of hopelessness, that climate change is so bad that nothing can make a difference. But what grounded me in that process was empathy. It was learning that other people are also experiencing this, and that the empathetic approach of understanding that there is action being taken, that Indigenous peoples have been taking actions against the colonial institutions that have caused climate change for so long, and that we can create a difference if we do come together and break these divides, like Yusuf was talking about, breaking these silos that we're experiencing. And so I'll leave with a bit of wisdom from my own faith that I've learned about. In Sikhism, as a practicing Sikh, I believe in this concept of oneness, that we're all connected, the environment, the people, and that oneness is critical. And we've all talked about that oneness that we experience when we connect with nature, that we go outside. And in order to be optimistic and be hopeful for the future, we need to ground that optimism with action. In Sikhism, there's this concept known as Chardi Kala, which means eternal optimism. In light of anything that's going on in the world, you have this internal fire that's lit that allows you to move forward. And so I truly believe that if all of us on this call and everyone listening, if we talk about that eternal optimism, if we incorporate that hope and action into our own lives, that we can be better off, we can break these divisions around climate, around racism, around the challenges that we face with reconciliation, and that we can be better tomorrow. I think that's the way that we empower young people, the way that we combat the climate crisis. And I think it's so important that we come together to do that. So thank you so much for giving me this platform to be able to share this. I've really appreciated the wisdom of everyone else here too. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Abhijit. We really appreciate you sharing your voice with us tonight. And again, an amazing journey, an amazing story, an amazing young man. I see the hearts popping up on the chat. So thank you again. That brings us to the end of our individual speaker segment. We're going to now enter a panel where it's more of a conversational, discussional format. And the topic is environmental stewardship amid a climate emergency, and the various themes that tie in with that. Our panel moderator tonight is Christine Boyle, a Vancouver City Councillor. Christine was elected to the Vancouver City Council back in 2018 municipal elections. She is a climate justice advocate, a United Church minister, and a community organizer. Christine has an amazing background with a Bachelor's of Science in Urban Architecture and First Nation Studies from the University of British Columbia, and a Master's in Religious Leadership for Social Change from the Graduate Theology Union in Berkeley, California. So I think very well suited for this panel and this event, and a wonderful ally for our communities and for environmental work across the province. We're also going to welcome back MLA Sonia Furstenau, a leader of the Green Party of British Columbia again. We have Victoria City Councillor Shamarke Dubo. Shamarke is a Somali-Canadian politician and human rights activist. He cast his first vote ever after coming to Canada as a refugee from originally from Somalia on October 20th, 2018, and at the same time was elected as a city councillor in Victoria. He's the first Black city councillor to be elected in Victoria in 152 years, as well as the first Muslim city councillor. Shamarke sits on various regional service and civic committees, including recently serving the Victoria Regional Transit Commission, which plays a large part in, transit plays a huge part in environmentalism and solving that. Outside of his civic duties, he's a board member of the Victoria Coalition for Survivors of Torture, the Broadbent Institute, the Climate Caucus, and the Vancouver Island Human Rights Coalition. He is a longtime former board member of the Canadian Council for Refugees. Interesting thing for us to be aware of is that in today's world, there's about 80 million forcibly displaced people and refugees. Within 8 to 9 years, that's going to be 300 million. And that statistic includes the vast majority of them being climate change refugees. So he is also sitting on the board of the Climate Caucus, which is a nonpartisan network of 300 plus locally elected climate leaders, driving systems change to help improve and transform our communities within the next decade. We'd also like to welcome back Kyle Imperingham from the Starfish Canada to the panel, and Sukhmeet Singh Sachal, so Abhijit's brother. Welcome, thank you very much for joining us. Sukhmeet is a 24-year-old humanitarian, public health advocate and environmental advocate. With his brother, he traveled to the Arctic, but he lived a lot longer there. I think it was 6 months that you stayed, and in Inuvik, so in the Northwest Territories, teaching biology, physics, and environmental sciences with Indigenous youth at a local high school there. And with his brother, he also co-created Break the Divide to help connect youth in North America to focus on topics of climate change, effects on mental health, and what solutions can be. So we are honored to have all of you here today with us. I'm going to pass it on to Christine to take it from here.
Thank you so much, Yusuf. And as others have said, it is just a total joy and honor to be in this conversation with all of these folks. I was finding myself a bit weepy at many of your words in the moment that we're in. So am so grateful. I am joining you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and like others, hold the weight of what it means to live on stolen land, with the histories we continue to reckon with. I hold that heavily this week and always, quite frankly, and am glad to hear so many folks weave that into these conversations about faith and climate action. So I get to moderate rather than talking much myself. I love that role. And thought I would, I'm gonna throw a question to each of our panelists first, and then we can kind of respond and engage in the way that Zoom sort of allows you to do. And I'm looking forward to it. I'm sure we won't have time to say all the things we could, and we'll just make do. So Shamarke, I'm hoping we can hear from you first, and particularly wonder what you have to say and what you hope we should hear about the impacts of the climate emergency on people around the world, and the impact that's having in terms of climate refugees, what that means for our families and communities abroad, as well as here in local governments and in our communities.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Christine. Thank you for inviting me, and it's great to be among friends, and I'm gratefully could say I know each one of you, and it gives me such a pleasure to really share space with you and bring us together so that we could have this conversation. But I want to acknowledge the territory that I'm joining upon virtually, and I want to acknowledge and show my respect and gratitude to the Lungquankans people whose traditional territory that I am, that I work, live, and build relationships, and I'm able to navigate, operate, and exist. The Songhees, Squamish, Saginaw people whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day, and to those of us who came here as settlers, as immigrants, either in this generation or in generation past, and to those of us who came here involuntarily, either as a result of transatlantic slave trade or from persecution from their homelands. And I make this acknowledgement not as some sort of historical footnote, but really as commitment to true and lasting reconciliation with Indigenous people, and someone who moved to Canada 8 years ago and have a history of uprooted from my own homeland as a child and being in different countries for 20 years and seeking a place that I'm able to call home. I always ask myself, what is my role and how could I be the best Canadian that I could be now that I'm a citizen? And always my answer comes into the best Canadian I could be is to play a role in reconciliation and learn the history of the country that I call home today. And speaking of that, and also I want to really speak, as we speaking about climate justice, and Suzanne early talk about trees and planting. And it really reminded me a Somali poet, and his name is Daliyat. And connecting to that, the horrific founding of the 215 children, he had a quote, and he said, even among plants, there is a revered tree that is spared the hidden. So too are there among people those who are immune from violence and should not be subjected to abuse. And he was talking about children, that every child deserves to have a home, respected and safe, and protected their well-being. And as someone who was uprooted in my own homeland as a refugee, and it's not only that I'm uprooted from my home, but the communities. And I remember as a child, your neighbor is also your parents. People know you by name, and they know who your parents were, which house you live, and so that sense of connection with the community, but also sense of connection to the land, the farms my family had, and that we used to go on the weekend, and also the streets that I play when it rains, and all those things. When you are uprooted and live with a sadden that as a child you don't even decide, and that is what the reality that refugee children face, which are half of the population today. So to me, each of the 215 children has a name, has a family, has a connection to community, land, and nation. And they're all loved. And we cannot forget that, because when we talk about numbers, it's not only statistical, and it is more than that. And as a country that I call home, Canada today, we need to get really serious and put the TRC call to justice into action, and importantly, listen to the indigenous voices and communities, and really be serious where our policies and our actions, and how does even our budgets reflect to the policies that we want to make real change. I just wanted to share that at the get-go. But in coming back to your question, Christine, and it's a very important question, and I would say I will break it to 3 points when we talk about our responsibilities and to the global south, and what we do here at the global north. The 3 points is, as a contributor to climate change, is very important to, when we talk about climate change, to speak about that, and how do we contribute to that and add to the greenhouse. And the challenges that people spoke earlier is that when we, as a cities, for instance, I'm a city leader and I'm elected and in city of Victoria, and the cities are forefront when it comes to any change and any challenge that we speak of in the world. And the climate change poses the greatest environmental challenge, and not only the heating of the Earth's atmosphere, but from global burning fossil and the greed and the big corporation. So taking a climate leadership of the question, how do we contribute to climate change, is very important. And at the City of Victoria, we are playing a role such as low carbon, high performance building, low carbon mobility, low carbon waste management, and even including demoviction, and how do we really think about circular economy. and think about municipal and adaptations and operations. But the biggest challenge I see as someone who's getting into this work in terms of policy, but climate has affected me because of the scarcity, and that's what creates conflicts, that's what creates droughts and all that, and which I'm not going to go into that, but because of that is where conflict happens and what creates displacement. So the biggest challenge in policy, and which Kyle spoke about earlier, is the creating a framework to assess climate action with an equity lenses. And that is where the biggest challenge of all levels of government, federal, provincial, and local government is struggling. And the other thing is that the cities being in front line, and we don't have a lot of power of how we should reduce emissions. And that is one of the biggest challenges. Vancouver has a Vancouver Charter, which gives them some power, but the rest of municipalities in BC, and we don't have so much of a power to do the work we want to do. And the other thing that I want to talk about is the donor community, so that if we contribute a lot to the climate change, but then what are we doing in terms of to play the global change, and how are we funding and doing investment in the global south, and invest in communities, civil societies, and groups are really at forefront in tackling climate change, and how do we really fund those? And I was very fortunate, for me, outside of my city work, to be Global Cities Fund for Inclusive Pandemic Response when the COVID-19 hit. And the idea was to fund cities and municipalities that are really forefront. And I want to share, we've chosen 5, and the group is through the migration, the Mayor's Migration Task Force. And one of the cities that was chosen was Freetown in Sierra Leone, and they got one of the funding cities to fund. And the Global City Fund for Inclusive Pandemic was $1 million initiative to respond to unmet needs of cities as they support migrants, refugees, and internally displaced. So what the Freetown did was to work with internally displaced people and refugees, and use the fund to expand its waste management macro enterprise program to ensure more youth living in formal settlement, many of whom are rural migrants, access to the opportunity to jointly improve their livelihood and the public health of their communities now and in the future. So it's really important that when the Global North do funding, to really look at communities that are impacted, and how are we really funding those cities who face, because the 85% of the refugees end up in developing countries and the least developing countries. They don't come to the Western countries and Global North. The number is small compared to what Uganda or Kenya or other countries in the developing countries would receive. And the other one is in terms of receiving refugees. And it's very important to speak about, because when we speak about climate change and climate crisis, we cannot separate racism and discrimination of the work we do, and how environmental crisis and racism is one of the many challenges that people of color, indigenous, Black face all the time. and sometimes it really makes it hard. So when people come and seek asylum or move to global north, then you see a lot of countries closing their doors to the refugees and having policies that tense back people. And it's very important that we have to really think how racialized people who are third generation, fourth generation, and that live in countries that has highest emissions, and how are we implementing programs and policies that support that, such as public transit and addressing racism and equity together. And we have to address them together because they're really interconnected issue. Both the climate crisis and racism are rooted in history of colonialism, as Sonia clearly and very clearly and historically spoke about, and extraction and exploitation. So it is important to recognize that these histories have continued and still are impacting people today. They're not only history, they are impacting indigenous community now. So just to conclude, how our actions even impact is that Canada still has numerous mining interests overseas in African countries. And these economic activities have impact on environmental and health of those communities across the world, and displacement. And one other thing that Kyle and Sonia really touched was the idea of silos and trade-offs and where we prioritize. So we can't afford to take single issue approach when we want to respond to crisis, because business as usual doesn't work for anyone. And single issue approach and silos, to be honest, we don't have the time, and we can't live single issue lives because those are impacted interactionality.
Thank you so much, Shamarke. I wish we got to be in the same room to have more of this conversation. I'm always grateful for the way that you pull threads together and connect all of these issues in your own life and in your leadership in the community. So thank you for that. I'm going to ask a question of Sukhmeet next, and I know it's weighty to follow your younger sibling, so no pressure, but we're delighted to have you here, and I'm really excited to hear from you. I'm wondering if you can speak to us a bit about your own personal journey as a young climate leader, and of course take that wherever you want, but really excited to hear some more of your own story.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. I really appreciate it, the honor and the opportunity to be here amongst all of you amazing people. And I agree, it is definitely a hard act to follow. My brother, who speaks phenomenally, and I cannot follow that, but I will try my best. My journey really started, and I've been reflecting on the title of this event, Saving Our Planet, Faith in Action, since I was asked to speak here. And I've really been reflecting on the key moments in my life, on how these two worlds have been intersecting in my life. And so it really started actually when I was in grade 7. And this is a moment that I often forget, but it was my teacher who reminded me of this and the small action that I took in my elementary school that helped make a difference. And so in grade 7, there were a lot of my Indigenous friends in my class that were being bullied. And this was something that really bothered me, because when I immigrated to Canada from India, I was bullied for wearing a turban, for my Indian accent, for the food that I ate. And so I already knew how it felt to be bullied. And I really didn't want other people in my class to be bullied in the same way. And so these Indigenous students in my class, my friends, I really wanted to do something for them. And again, in grade 7, like I had no idea that this would leave an impact or anything. I was 12 years old or 11, I don't remember exactly, but I went up to my teacher and I asked my teacher, I'm like, we need to do something for the Indigenous students in our class. And she's like, this is the first time I'm ever hearing this, that there's this, this Indian kid that wants to do something for the Indigenous students. And she's like, okay, like, let's do something. And so we ended up doing a powwow dance where elders came. And it was the first time in my elementary school where Indigenous peoples were really being celebrated. And in this powwow dance, I was the only non-Indigenous person dancing on the stage at first with my Indigenous friends. But by the end of the entire assembly, the entire school was up on their feet and joining in on this dance. And why I'm sharing this story is because this moment really highlighted the importance for me for recognizing that Indigenous peoples have been living here forever. And it was at this moment where I actually met the elders who came to the school, and they were teaching people about their histories, about how they've been living their lives on the land. And I think this is really the defining moment where I really started understanding about environmentalism. I still remember that there was a teepee set up in the school soccer field, and we all got to go in there as students. We were all so excited. We're like, wow, what's in there? And they all had these traditional medicines over there. And they were just explaining to us how they rely on a lot of things from the land. They had traditional foods available as well that were very sustainable and harvested from the land as well. And that's where I really understood the connection of how important it is to be living off the land for them. And this made me reflect on my ancestors back in India, where I'm from. And I realized how people in Punjab are reliant on farms over there for sustainable living. And so these are the connections that I started to create. And as I continued my journey, when I went to high school, I joined all these different programs, whether that was my school's global awareness committee, or started the Surrey Sustainability Network, or joined the Metro Vancouver Youth Sustainability Network. And this is the platforms that I really found were so helpful for me. I met youth from all across Vancouver and the Lower Mainland who were doing amazing things, and it really inspired me. I think that's where I actually met Kyle as well. And it was just amazing to see all these incredible people doing these things. And so I think that's really what motivated me to continue doing this work. And it wasn't until, like my brother mentioned about Break the Divide before, I spent 6 months living in the Arctic in 2017. And this is where I felt that I was finally starting to understand what climate change was all about. And so during this time, I was spending up there teaching Indigenous youth sciences, whether that be biology, chemistry, physics, and environmental sciences. And I started doing this program over there where I was talking to Indigenous youth and asking them, what are the things that are troubling you in your community? What are the things that we can do together to help uplift everyone around us? And so they were really starting to have these conversations with me about climate change, about mental health, about reconciliation. And this is when my brother was actually just coming back from the Arctic as well. And we thought, why not have these conversations between kids in my brother's school and the kids that I'm teaching up here in the Arctic? And so we started with a small dialogue. Literally the first call that we had was in 2017, where these youth were just talking to each other and they were asking the most random questions. Youth in Delta, BC were asking their friends in Inuvik, do you live with pet polar bears? Like, how do you get to your school? Like, what do you do up there? Because I guess these are things that were not being taught in our social studies textbooks. And so this is where we realized, we're like, wow, this is creating a powerful conversation that has never existed before, where we're connecting youth in the Arctic with youth in British Columbia. And what we realized the most about this, like my brother mentioned, we're all about turning empathy into action. We realized that after we created this conversation, youth in British Columbia really wanted to do something for now their friends living in the Arctic. So they started holding mental health nights in their school for the first time ever, where they were talking about how in the Arctic, suicide rates are 11 times higher than the national average in Canada, and how climate change is exacerbating these impacts. And so these are the conversations we realize are so important. Fast forward to now, we're in over 10 countries around the world, where we are now connecting youth across the world to talk about climate change, to talk about mental health, to talk about reconciliation. And now I think what's happened right now with the 215 children's bodies that have been found, I think it's really ignited a fire in all the people living, not only in Canada, but across the world, to realize that we all have a duty to uplift one another during these times. And I think with COVID now, what I think faith in action really means to me is something that's happened during this past year. A lot of the times, especially during times of crisis, people who are religious, they rely on their religious places, whether you're a Muslim, whether you're Sikh, whether you're Jewish, whether you're a Christian, and so forth. People like to go to the religious places, or they like to be in a congregation where they can learn from one another, where they can share their grievances, where they can share their hardships. And it was in June of 2020 when I went into the Gurdwara, and I started an initiative called the COVID-19 Sikh Gurdwara Initiative. And here, it started because I went into the Gurdwara and I asked one of the elders, how come you're not wearing a mask? How come you're not following the social distancing protocols? And he simply told me in Punjabi, he told me, he's like, well, there's not a mask that's available for me to tie around my turban. And all the protocols that are being said on the TV are all being done in English or in French. So it's not something that they could understand. And that's when I was like, wow, like these are things that the government or no one even thought about. Like they're missing a huge population that needs to be really getting the messaging. And so I started an initiative. As a medical student, I knew I couldn't be in the hospital right now because my training is not that far yet, but I knew with my public health background, I had to do something about this. And so I gathered over 150 youth volunteers and we went into these gurdwaras on the weekends where we then educated the public about COVID-19 in a culturally effective way in Punjabi and Hindi and Urdu, for instance. We're really teaching these public now about COVID-19 and people were finally starting to understand what COVID-19 was all about. And the only reason now why I'm sharing this story is now fast forward to now. We've advocated to the government now to have vaccine clinics, to Fraser Health as well, to have vaccine clinics in places of worship. And they finally started doing it. Now vaccine clinics are now happening in gurdwaras and mandirs and mosques and churches. Why? Because it's a place where people feel comfortable, where people now can take action and get their vaccines, for instance. And the only reason I'm sharing this entire story from this past year is because I believe faith is so important in times of crisis. Climate crisis is the most important crisis we are ever facing. COVID-19 is something that now we're finally feeling, but the climate crisis is going to be something that's going to surpass this to another level that we've never imagined before, where concepts like solastalgia, the feeling of being at home but not really being at home, are going to be impacting people's mental health. And so I think faiths during these times need to band together like we are right now. Having these important conversations, which I think are so important. And what I've learned over this past year is people in communities of faith, they have so much power, but they don't have the opportunities to unleash them. And I think we need to continue having these conversations with different faith groups to allow these conversations to happen, because I know that we can actually save our planet if we continue to have these faiths in action and continue to move forward. So thank you so much for having me here today.
Sukhmeet, that was amazing. Thank you for all of those words, but even more so the leadership that you're providing on so many different fronts, and your articulation of how these issues overlap and hit the ground for people in communities, and then how you show up with community to address them. It's really, really powerful. Thank you for all of that. I'm gonna move to Kyle next. And Kyle, I wonder, there are so many questions I would ask of each of you. Kyle, I was struck by when you spoke earlier, your articulation of the shift that is needed and that we're in, hopefully from the environmental movement of the past to the climate justice movement of today. And I'd be interested to hear, in your experience in this work, how we work and learn across generations in that shift and in the very urgent and intersectional work that we need to be doing.
Thanks, Christine, and as always, great to see you. So I was tapped on the shoulder to be the youth representative on, this is a lot of words, Environment and Climate Change Canada's expert panel on climate change, adaptation, and resilience. I almost run out of breath saying it. And it was a great privilege to be a part of it. And through that experience, I learned about in firsthand how sometimes we put the youth representative as the youth representative, and for the reason, although all done with good intentions, sometimes it comes into this like tokenistic way, or the youth voice has to adapt to the voices in the room, and there's a lot of other dynamics that have come in. One of the ones that I loved once was that we were in a conversation, and I grew up in a space where I always have felt rude interrupting people. I'm not very good at doing that. I was in a space in Ottawa, of all places, and everyone consistently talked over each other. I wasn't finding space to talk. One time someone just leaned over to me and was like, you need to interrupt people if you want to talk, right? No one's going to make space for you. And recognizing that moment, I was like, wow, why not? Like, why do I have to? I don't think it's fair to ask the youngest voice in the room that they have to interrupt. And so there's things there that are a little bit generational. I do think that there's a certain element of how things have sort of progressed as we've created governments and in different spaces, and how we've interacted with each other in order to create progress. Recognizing that some of that progress was good and some of it was not. Yusuf talked about I think you said the word like reverse mentoring in one moment there. And that's one of the things that I think is also a part of the dynamic shift and that we're trying to build in, is that young people do want to learn. They're not people like, young people don't come in most of the time, and this is a generality, but I think they come in wanting to learn. I don't think they think that they have all the answers, but they think that they have ideas. And I think sometimes, we want to, like as young people, we want to be able to share our ideas and be able to be genuinely heard. I think many people recognize that every time you share an idea doesn't mean it's exactly going to be implemented the way that you said it should. But if we can create space for inclusion, for people to just have conversation and have understanding of each other, that's what we're after. And we know we can make better outcomes when we do that. And so I think that's the generational shift I see. We have run a mentorship program here at the Starfish Canada and the best news we got back from it was when the mentors told us that they felt they actually learned more. They felt like they almost did nothing and that they were the mentee. And that to me was very heartwarming to know that, we brought people into space to learn from a lot of our top 25 environmentalists under 25 winners, and who said that they would like mentorship to accelerate to the next stage of their career. And one of the biggest outcomes for a mentor was that they learned a lot along the way. I think when we take that mindset that we're all in this together, that there is not one voice, even, and I say it with a lot of love and kindness to elected officials who often are in seats of power. Sometimes people think that like, you have all the answers, you must tell us, we put you in there because but really, and as you all have done and shown in a lot of the work I've seen over the years, you believe in community. You think that a lot of community has a part of that answer. And that's why I think a lot of people gravitate towards empathetic leaders like yourselves, is because that it's about community and building that together. It's not about gaps. It's about creating space for each other.
Thank you so much for that, and all of your leadership too, Kyle. I'm always glad, even though we're separated by some water, to get to be in conversation with you. And such a perfect lead into closing with Sonia, who I too am constantly inspired by as a empathetic and grounded leader in her work, who I think, like me, knows we don't actually really have all the answers, but we listen and learn as we go. Sonia, I'm curious, I wrote down when you were speaking earlier a line you said, which was that we will write a better story if we're writing it together. And it's a message I heard articulated in a slightly different way from nearly all of our speakers, and that I know, or that I see you leading with in the work you're doing. I wonder if you have okay, so this is going to slightly go against what I just said about how we're learning as we go too, but I'm curious if you have advice or lessons you've learned along the way that you want to lift up for the rest of us as we do this work together.
Thanks, Christine. And what an inspiring evening this has been. Every single one of you have just spoken words that have penetrated my heart. I feel more hopeful now than I did 2 hours ago. So thank you for that. I think so much of what has been talked about this evening really reflects for me a lot of my experiences and a lot of what I would say we should be learning. Sukhmeet and your brother, the idea of empathy, being rooted in empathy, is, I think, so essential. We tend to engage in conflict or engage in challenges with a kind of dehumanizing or make an enemy of the people that disagree with us, as opposed to saying, okay, I want to hear where you're at and why you're there, and then I want to figure out how we can work together to find a solution. And I think Suzanne's wisdom that she brings and is really what all of us, I think this is going to be my motto going forward, is just be the forest. Right? The forest, every part of the forest interacts with every other part and supports and connects. And it's not like I'm looking out, like the arbutus tree says to the cedar tree, get out of here. We don't want you here. The arbutus tree and the cedar tree kind of work together and figure out how they can support each other. And so much of, like, I think back to Sean again, and this was really where I spent a lot of time on the activist side of thing and trying to get a government to listen, Kyle, as you say. People elected don't have all the answers. And it was fairly early on that I realized anger, hatred were not going to sustain us, and that we had to operate always from a place of kindness and empathy, compassion, love, create the future that we were wanting, that we were standing up and fighting for, and then approach those elected people with that empathy and with solutions, with an understanding of the challenges that they face in the roles that they're in. And Shamarki and Christine, I know you know all of this very well. People think that we can solve everything instantly. We can't. And to come with solutions. And I think since taking on this role of leader of our party, I talk a lot about purpose and joy. Just root the work in purpose. Have a sense of where you want to get to. What does that future look like? What does it feel like? How is it going to be for all of us when we're there? And then remember that this hard work of trying to make positive change in the world has to come with joy attached to it. And I thank all of you for the joy of this evening, and Yusuf for the joy that you continually bring when you bring people together. We are facing a lot of crises right now. The environmental crisis, the climate crisis, our social crisis, inequality crisis. And crises can operate to pull us together where we see that shared humanity and that shared mission, or they can drive us apart because of fear and because of our sense of, how do I take care of myself and my loved ones? And I think all of us need to lean into being the forest. We need to pull each other together in the face of these crises and recognize that we can build something very, very beautiful on the other side.
Thank you so much, Sonia. That was a perfect way to wrap this up. And I'm actually not going to try to say anything more to close. That was really moving. And thank you. And I'm just going to pass it back to Yusuf, and I'll echo the convening that you and Tarek and others are doing so so important. So thanks for bringing us all together, and I'll pass it back to you to close us off.
Well, thank you so much, Christine, and it was an honor to see you moderate the panel. It's always wonderful when things go so smoothly. So, thank you very much for that. I know you stayed a bit longer than you were able, and again, I appreciate your time, your voice, and your commitment to helping in these projects that we collectively work on. Really, thank you everyone for joining us today. I really want to thank our co-organizers as well as allies for their support in bringing together this program. Extend a heartfelt appreciation to our speakers. Guys, please remember to follow them all on social media so you can keep updated with the latest events and publications and thoughts from the speakers here tonight. Now, as communities and individuals trying to make positive change in the world, we really need to empower and support one another with tools and resources and knowledge and support that is needed. This includes such things as developing workshops, practical real-world workshops in diverse languages, whether, as Sukhmeet was saying, whether it's Punjabi, whether it's Urdu or Hindi or Arabic, or Mandarin or Cantonese, but to share the message in a variety of languages, to create religiously or culturally sensitive environmentalism workshops and programs. And of course, as we discussed, the importance of reverse mentorships and spaces for inclusion. Practically, guys, I would like to invite everyone and encourage them to go visit our friends at Starfish at thestarfish.ca to learn more about their workshops and practical resources available. And in Islam Unravelled's monthly newsletter, we'll also be sharing resources in the upcoming weeks about how we can practically take steps to address this at the global to local levels. So thank you again to the Reverend Blair Odney, President of the Pacific Mountain Regional Council of the United Church of Canada. Thank you so much, Sonia Firstenow, leader of the BC Green Party, for joining us. Dr. Suzanne Simard from the University of British Columbia. Get her book, Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom in the Forest. And then you can tell your friends, I read it before it became a movie. We also would like to thank Mariam Noor Vahid, chairperson of Green Ummah. Please follow them on all their social media handles on Green Ummah, because as soon as their toolkit is ready, they'll be sharing that there. Kyle and Perringham, thank you so much. Awesome working with you on this project. Abhijit Singh Sachal, thank you. Again, Break the Divide is the organization he co-founded with his brother, Sukhmeet Singh Sachal. So thank both of you for joining, and congratulations on the top 25 under 25 environmentalist youth leader acknowledgements. It's well deserved. And again, thank you so much, Shamarke, for joining us. Always a pleasure to hear your voice and hear from your wisdom. Now, guys, on June 8th, so this was the first part of Saving Our Planet Faith in Action, dealing with World Environment Day. On June 8th, we're going to have World Oceans Day, and that'll be the second part of this event. So that will start at 5:30 p.m. PST, which is 8:30 p.m. EST, and will be live streamed on our YouTube page, Islam Unravelled Anti-Racism Initiative. Some of the speakers we'll have then include Miss Anna Mae Paul, leader of the Green Party of Canada, Rabbi Dan Muskowitz from Temple Shalom, Vancouver, Alison Gu, another top 25 under 25 environmentalist, and a bit of a change from this event, which is going to be an in-depth keynote address from Dr. Rashid Somali from the University of British Columbia, Department of Oceans and Fisheries. So he'll take us into an in-depth journey about the situation in our oceans and some of the challenges as well as potential solutions that we can look at. Now, just to close this event, I'm going to actually pass it on to my colleague, Tarek Tayyab, who really played such a central role in bringing everything here together, to share some final words and help end the night for us.
Well, the final words is, Yusuf, you're awesome. Great work, and great work to everybody. And thank you for coming together like this. We all share the same vision, and grateful to work with you all and working with you all in the future. So thank you again, and we'll see you at our next events. Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Take care.